Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Charles Archer. Book 3. The Cross. Part 3. The Cross. Chapter 1. All fires burn out at last. There came a time when these words of Simon Dar rang again in Kristin's heart. It was the summer of the 4th year after Erland Nikolausson's death, and of her flock of sons, only Gaut and Lavrans were left with their mother at Jorengard. 2 years before, the old smithy had burned down, and Gaut had built a new one north of the manor up by the high road. The old smithy had lain south of the houses, down towards the river in a hollow between Jorun's barrow and some mighty heaps of stones that they said had been cleared from off the fields in ancient days. Well nigh every year at flood time the water had come right up to the smithy. Now nothing was left to mark the spot but the heavy fire-cracked slabs of stone that showed where the door had been, and the masoned fireplace. Fine, soft, pale green grass sprouted up now from the black, charcoal-covered ground. Kristin Lavransdatter had a plot of flax this year close to the old smithy ground. Gaut would have corn now on the fields nearer the manor, where the mistress of Jorengard, time out of mind, had been wont to sow flax and raise onions. And Kristin often had errands that took her that way, besides looking to her flax. On Thursday evenings she bore her gift of ale and meat to the old man of the barrow. On bright summer eves the lonely hearth on the meadow would look then like some age-old heathen altar glimmering there amidst the grass, greyish-white and streaked with soot. On scorching hot summer days she would go with her basket to the stone heaps at noontide to pluck raspberries, or gather the willow herb leaves that are so good for brewing cooling drinks against the fever sickness. The last notes of the church bell's midday greeting to God's mother died away in the light-drenched air between the mountains. The countryside seemed to lay itself to rest under the flooding white sunshine. Since dewy dawn, the song of the scythes in the flowery meadows, the ring of whetstones on iron, and voices calling had sounded from the farms far and near. Now all sounds of toil were hushed. The midday rest sank over all. Kristin sat on the stone heap, listening. Only the rush of the river could be heard now, and the faint rustling of the leaves in the grove. The thin buzz and muted hum of flies and gnats above the meadow, the clink of a lonely cowbell somewhere far away. A bird winged its way, swift and silent, along the edge of the alder thicket. A bird rose from the meadow tussocks and flew with a shrill twitter to light on a thistle-stalk. But the drifting blue shadows along the hillside, the fair weather clouds that piled up over the edge of the fells and melted in the blue summer sky, the glitter of the Lagan's water between the tree trunks, the white gleam of the sunlight on all the leaf trees. These things she was aware of as the voice of the stillness heard by an inner ear, rather than as seen by the eye. With her coif drawn over her brow to ward off the sun, Kristin sat listening to the play of light and of shadows over the dale. All fires burn out at last. In the alderwood along the marshy river bank, pools of water glittered in the darkness between the thick-growing sallows. Sedge grew there, and tufts of cotton grass, and thick as a carpet the marsh cinquefoil covered the ground with its grey-green 5-fingered leaves and red-brown blossoms. Kristin had plucked a heavy bunch of them. Often she had wondered whether this herb might not have in it some useful virtue. She had dried it and seethed it and added it to ale and mead, but it didn't seem to work. Yet could Kristin never forbear to go out into the marsh and wet her shoes to gather it. Now she stripped all the leaves from the stems and wove a wreath of the dark flower heads. They were like both red wine and brown mead in hue. They were moist as with honey at the base of the red bunches of filaments. Sometimes Kristin would weave a wreath for the picture of Mary Virgin in the upper hall. Such was their wont in southern lands, she had heard from priests who had been there. Otherwise she had no one now to make wreaths for. Here in the dale it was not the young men's use to deck themselves with wreaths when they went to dance on the green. In the Trondheim country, the men who came home from serving in the bodyguard had brought the custom with them to some places. The mother thought this thick, dark red wreath had gone passing well with Gout's light-hued face and flaxen yellow hair, or with Lavrans's nut-brown mane. It was an endless age, since the time when she would walk with all her little sons and their foster mothers in the pasture above Huseby, those long, fair summer days. Then she and Frida could not make wreaths fast enough for all the impatient little ones. She remembered when she had Lavrans at her breast still, and Ivar and Skule had deemed the suckling child too should have a wreath. But it must be of quite little flowers, said the 4-year-olds. Now she only had grown-up children. Young Lavrans was 15 winters old. He should not be counted as full-grown yet, maybe. But as time went on, the mother had grown aware that this son stood farthest from her of all her children. He did not hold himself aloof from her of set purpose, as Björgulf had done. He was not self-wrapped, nor seemed he close-lipped like the blind boy. But it was like he was yet more silent than he by nature. Only no one had marked it when all the brothers were at home. He was bright and fresh, and seemed ever glad and well-humoured, and all were fond of the winsome child, and never gave it a thought that Lavrans well-nigh always went alone, and spoke but little. He was held to be the fairest of all Kristin of Jorungard's fair sons. Their mother always thought the one that, at the moment she thought on, to be perhaps the fairest. But she felt, she too, now, how Lavrans Erlendsson seemed to give out brightness. His light brown hair and apple-fresh cheeked seemed, as it were, gilded, full-filled with sunshine. His great dark grey eyes, too, seemed sown full of yellow sparks. He was much like what she herself had been in her youth, with her bright skin hue veiled, as it were, with sun-browning. And he was big and strong for his age, stout and handy at all work he was put to, biddable with his mother and elder brothers, cheerful, kind and friendly. But nevertheless there was this strange aloofness about the boy. On winter evenings, when the household gathered in the weaving house and passed the time with jest and gossip, while each one had his work to keep him busy, Lavrans would sit as in a dream. Many a summer evening, when the day's work on the manor was done, Kristin would go out and sit down by this boy, where he lay on the green, chewing resin or rolling a sprig of sorrel in the corner of his mouth. She noticed his eyes as she talked with him. It was as though he fetched his thoughts home from far away. Then he would smile up into his mother's face, answer her clearly and with understanding. Often they two would sit out on the bank for hours in close and easy talk. But no sooner did she rise to go in than it seemed as though Lavrans let his thoughts wander far afield again, and it was impossible for her to make out what it was the boy thought so deeply on. He was good enough at sports and with his weapons, yet he was much less keenly set on such things than had been her other sons, and he never went off alone hunting, though he was glad when Gout took him out along with him. So far, at any rate, he did not seem to notice that women looked upon his fair youth with kind eyes. He had no mind at all to book learning, and he paid no attention to all the talk of his elder brother's purpose to go into a cloister. Kristin could not see that the lad looked for any other lot than to stay here at home all his days, helping out with the farming, even as he now did. Sometimes Kristin thought that these strange absent ways of Lavran's put her in mind somewhat of his father. But Erland's soft, drowsy ways has often given place to wild wantonness, and Lavran's lacked altogether his father's hasty, vehement moods. Erland had never been far away from what went on about him. Lavran's was the youngest now. Soon it would be a long time that Munin had slept in the graveyard beside his father and his little brother. He died early in spring, the year after Erland was slain. The widow had gone about after her husband's death as though she neither heard nor saw. More than pain and sorrow, she felt a numbing chill, a dull nervelessness in body and soul, as if she herself was still bleeding to death from his death wounds. The whole of her life had lain within his arms, since that thunder-fraught midday hour in the outbarn at Skog, when for the first time she gave herself to Erland Nicolaisen. Then was she so young and so innocent, and knew so little what she was doing, that she strove to hide that she was near weeping, because he caused her pain, while she smiled because she thought she gave her lover the most precious gift. And whether, after all, it had been a good gift or not, at least she had given him herself wholly and for ever. Her maidenhood, which God and his mercy had adorned with comeliness and health when he caused her to be born to a safe and honourable lot, and which her parents had guarded with most loving strictness all the years she was in their care. With both hands she had given everything to Erland, and thereafter she had lived only in his arms. How often, in the years that followed, had she suffered his caresses, hard and cold with anger, dutifully yielded to her husband's will, while she felt as though she must perish, worn out with weariness. She had thought, with a kind of wrathful joy, when she looked on Erland's fair face and sound and comely body, that could no longer blind her to the man's faults. Yes, he was as young and fair as ever. He could still overpower her with his caresses, as fiery as when she too was young. But she was old, she thought, and with the thought came a kind of passion of victorious pride. It is easy for those who never learn a lesson to keep their youth, for those who will not fit themselves to the fate life brings them, nor to strive to master fate by man's will. But even when she met his kisses with hard locked lips, and turned with all her being from him to the fight for her son's future, she knew dimly it was with the fire this man had once and for all kindled in her blood that she threw herself into the work. The years had chilled her, so she thought, for she no longer grew hot when Erland's eyes had that old gleam, and his voice had that deep note which had made her sink down, will-less and strengthless with happiness, when first she knew him. But as then she had longed to drown the heaviness and heartache of separation in her meetings with Erland, so afterwards she longed dully yet feverishly after a goal which would be reached when, one day, a white-haired old woman, she saw her son's lot settled and secure. Then it was for Erland's sons that she suffered the old dread of the uncertainty that lay before them. She was tormented still by a craving like hunger and burning thirst. She must see her sons thrive and flourish. And as at first she had given herself wholly to Erland, so afterwards she gave herself wholly to the world that had sprung up around their wedded life, flung herself in the breach to answer every call that must be met, threw herself into every work that must be done to safeguard Erland's and his children's welfare. She half understood herself that she lived always with Erland. When she sat at Huseby pondering with their priest over the papers in her husband's chest, when she talked with his tenants and working folk, busied herself with her serving wenches in storehouse and kitchen, sat up in the horse paddock with the foster mothers, keeping watch on her children on fair summer days. It seemed to her as though it was against Erland she turned her wrath when anything went wrong in the house and when the children crossed their mother's will. It was to him her heartfelt joy went forth when they got the hay in dry in summer, or did well with the corn in autumn, when her calves throve, and when she heard her boys shout and laugh in the courtyard. The thought that she was his glowed hidden in her heart when she laid aside, full finished, the last of the holy day garments for the 7 sons, and stood joyful, looking at the pile of goodly, well-wrought work done by her own hands through the winter. It was of him she was sick and weary when, of a spring evening, she went home from the river with her women, and they had washed wool from the last shearing, boiled water in a cauldron by the strand, rinsed the wool in the stream. And the mistress herself felt as though her back were broken across, and was coal-black with wool dirt high up her arms, and the smell of sheep and greasy filth had soaked into her clothes till it seemed 3 baths would not make her body clean again. And now that he was gone, it was as though the widow could see no meaning any more in her life's restless busyness. He had been cut down, and so she must die, like a tree whose roots are severed. The young suckers that had shot up around her lap must grow now from their own roots. They were old enough for each of them to take order for his own lot. The thought flitted through Kristin's mind, if she had but understood this before, that time when Erland had said it. Shadow-like pictures of a life with Erland up on his mountain croft drifted across her mind. They too, grown young again, the little child beside them. But it was not that she repented or grieved for what might have been. She herself could not have parted her life from her sons' lives. Now death would part them soon. For without Erland she had not strength to live. All that had happened, and all that was yet to happen, was their doom. All things fall out as they are doomed to fall. She grew grey of hair and skin, scarce cared to keep her trim or put her clothes on rightly. At night she lay and thought of her life with Erland. In the day she went about as in a dream, never spoke with any until spoken to, seemed not even to hear when her little sons spoke to her. The watchful and hard-working housewife set her hand to no work. Love had underlain all her strivings with earthly things. Erland had given her little thanks for it. It was not in that way that he wanted to be loved. But she could not do otherwise. It was in her nature to love with much toil and care. At this time she seemed to be slipping down towards the trance of death. Then came a sickness that ran through all the parish and laid her sons upon a sickbed, and the mother awoke once more. The sickness was more perilous for grown folk than for children. On Ivar it took such a hold that no one thought that he would live. The young lad had a giant strength in his fever fits. He roared and struggled to get up and seize his weapons. His father's death seemed to run in his mind. It was all Nakvi and Björgulf could do to hold him down by main force. Then Björgulf was laid low. Lavrans lay with his face so swollen with the breaking sores, it scarce seemed his own. His eyes glittered dully through 2 small slits. It seemed as though they must burn out in the glowing fever. Their mother watched over these 3 in the loft. Narkvi and Gout had had the sickness as small children, and Skule was much less sick than his brothers. Frida looked to him and Munin down below in the hall. No one thought that Munin was in any peril, but he had never been strong, and one evening, when they all believed he was near well, all of a sudden he went off into a swoon. There was scarce time for Frida to warn his mother. Kristin ran down, and a moment after, Munin breathed his last in her arms. The child's death awoke her to a new, wide-eyed despair. Her wild sorrow for the suckling that died at its mother's breast had been, as it were, tinged red by the memory of all her slain dreams of happiness. The very storm in her heart had borne Kristin up in those days, and the fearful strain that had ended but when she saw her husband slain before her eyes left behind it such a weariness of soul that Kristin herself thought for sure she would soon die of grief for Erland. But this certainty had dulled the edge of sorrow. She had lived, feeling dusk and shadows thicken around her, while she waited for the door to be opened for her too. But over Munin's little corpse the mother stood grey and wide awake. The fair, sweet little boy had been her youngest child for so many years, the last little one that she still dared fondle and laugh at, when she should have been stern and grave and have corrected her son for all his misdeeds and giddinesses. And he had been so loving and so fond of his mother. It seemed to cut into her very flesh, so bound she was still to life. It was not so easy as she had thought for a woman to die, when she has poured her life's blood into so many new young hearts. In cold, steadfast despair she passed to and fro between the child that lay on the dead straw and her 6 sons. Munin lay in the old storehouse, where first the little babe and then the father had lain. 3 corpses in her home in less than 1 year. With a heart withered with dread, but stark and dumb, she waited for the next to die. She waited as for a relentless fate. She had never set store enough by the gift she had got when God granted her so many children. And the worst was that she had understood it in a fashion. But she had thought more on the troubles, the pangs, the fears and struggles, though she had learned over and over again, through what she missed each time a child grew too great for her arms, through the delight each time a fresh one lay upon her bosom, that the joy was unspeakably greater than the labour and the pain. She had murmured because the children's father was so trustless a man, with little forethought for the line that should come after him. She forgot always that he had been no other. That time she broke God's law and trod her own kin beneath her feet to come to him. Now he had been torn from her side. And now she looked to see her sons die one by one. Perchance it was her lot to be left a childless mother at the last. There were so many things that before she had seen indeed, but not thought of much, the time she saw the whole world through the mist of her own love and Erland's. She had seen, truly, that to Narkvi it was an earnest matter, that he was the firstborn, and he was to be head and leader of the band of brothers. She had seen, too, that he loved Munin dearly. Yet she was shaken, as by something unlooked for, when she saw his vehement sorrow at the youngest brother's death. But the other sons grew well again, though but slowly. On Easter Sunday she was able to go to church with 4 sons, but Björgulf lay abed still, and Ivar was too weak to go outside the house. Lavrans had grown much in height while he lay on his sick-bed, and in other ways too it was as though this half-year's happening had advanced him far beyond his age. And so it seemed to Kristin that she was an old woman now. A woman must be held young, she thought, so long as she had little children sleeping in her arms at night, playing about their mother in the daytime, and needing her care day and night. When her little ones have grown too great for this, a mother is an old woman. Her new brother-in-law, Charles Halvardsson, spoke to her of the Erlandssons' tender age, and of how she herself was but a little over 40 years old. She would soon feel, perhaps, that she must wed again. She needed a husband to help her with the care of the estate and the nurture of the young sons. He named more than one good man who he thought might be a fitting match for Kristin. She must visit their home at Ailinn in the fall, and he would see to it that she met them, and thereafter they could talk more nearly of this matter. Kristin smiled wanly. Ah, yes, she was no more than 40 years of age. Had she heard of another woman that had been widowed with a flock of growing children? She had said, as Jamelt had said, she must wed again, seek the comfort of a new husband. She might even have more children by him. But she herself would not. It was when the Easter holidays were just gone by that Jamelt of Ailinn came to Jorengard, and Kristin met her sister's new husband for the second time. She and her sons had gone neither to the betrothal at Differen nor to the bride ale at Ailinn. The two feasts had been held with but short space between, that spring when she was heavy with her last child. As soon as Jamelt had heard of the slaying of Erland Nicolausson, he had hastened to Sill. With reed and deed he helped his wife's sister and sister's sons, ordered as well as he could all that must be done after the master's death, and took upon him the conduct of the charge against the manslayers, since none of the Erlandssons was yet of age. But at that time Kristin knew nothing of what went on around her. Even the judgment on Gudmund Thorisson, who was found to be Erland's slayer, seemed to stir her but little. This time she spoke more with her brother-in-law, and he seemed to her a man to be liked. He was not young. He and Simon Dar were much the same age. He was a quiet, steady man, tall and big, of darker hue than common, comely of face, but somewhat stooped. He and Gaut were good friends at once. Narkby and Björgulf, since their father's death, had held themselves yet closer together and apart from all the rest. But Ivar and Skule told their mother they liked Jamelt well. Yet it seems to us nonetheless that Ramborg might well have done so much honour to Simon as to stay a widow a little longer. This new husband of hers is nothing like Simon. Kristin noticed that these two madcaps of hers still remembered Simon Andresen. They had let themselves be guided by him, whether with sharp words or with kindly jest, though they would not suffer a word of correction from their own father and mother without their eyes flashing and their hands clenching with rage. While Jamelt was at Jorengard, Munin Bardson too came hither to visit Kristin. Not much now was left of Sir Dance Munin. He had been wide of girth and portly in the old days, and he had borne his heavy body not without grace, so that he looked taller and more stately than he was. Now the gout had crooked him, and the skin hung loosely on his shrunken frame. He looked most like a little hobgoblin, wholly bald but for a scant fringe of limp white tufts about his nape. Once a strong blue-black beard had darkened his smooth plump cheeks and chin, but now grey stubble grew rankly in all the flabby folds of his chin and neck, whither his razor found it hard to make its way. He was grown blear-eyed, drivelled a little, and was much plagued with a weak stomach. With him he had his son Inge, whom folk called Fluga, after the mother. He was an oldish man already. The father had helped this son forward in the world right well, made a rich match for him, and got Bishop Halvard to lend Inge his countenance. Munin's wife Katrin had been the bishop's cousin, and therefore was Sir Halvard fain to help Inge to wealth, so that he should not trespass on the heritage of Lady Cutrin's children. The bishop held the Hedmarken wardenship in fief, and he had made Inge Munenson his deputy, so that he now owned a lot of land in Scone and Ridderboe. His mother, too, had bought her a manor in those parts. She was a most pious woman now, and did much good, and she had vowed to live a life of chastity until her death. "Ay, and she is not so old or so failing either," said Sir Munin testily, when he saw Kristin smile. He would have much preferred to have so ordered things that Brynhild should come to him and keep house for him at his manor near Hamar, but that she would not do. He had so little joy of his old days, Sir Munin complained. His children were so quarrelsome. The children of the same mother were at odds one with another, and fought and wrangled with their half-brothers and sisters. The worst was the youngest daughter. He had got her a paramour while he was a wedded man, so that he could leave her no heritage, and therefore she plundered her father of all she could lay her hands on while yet he lived. She was a widow, and had sat down at Skogheim, the manor that was Sir Munin's proper seat, and neither her father nor her brothers and sisters could get her to leave. Munin was very afraid of her, but when he tried to escape and live with any of his other children, he was plagued there too with complaints of the others' greed and dishonest dealings. He was happiest with the youngest of his true-born daughters, who was a nun at Gimsoy. He very much liked to be in the hostel there for a while. At such times he strove much to make his soul with penance and prayers under his daughter's guidance, but he could not put up with the life there for too long. Kristin was not sure that Brynhild's sons were much kinder towards their father than the other children, but this Munin Bardson would not agree to. He loved them best of all his offspring. But, miserable as this kinsman of hers now was, it was while he was with her that Kristin's stony sorrow first seemed to melt a little. Sir Munin talked of Erland early and late. When he was not groaning over his own trials, he was always speaking of his dead cousin and boasting of Erland's deeds, but most of all of his reckless youth. Erland's wild pranks when first he was let loose into the world, away from his home at Huseby, where Lady Magnhild evermore gloomed at his father, and the father gloomed at his eldest son, and from Hesnaes and his grave, pious foster-father, Sir Bard. Sir Munin's prattle might have seemed strange comfort for Erland's sorrowing widow, but in his own way the knight had loved his young kinsman, and had always thought that Erland outshone all other men in comeliness and manhood. Ay, and in understanding as well, said Munin eagerly, only that he didn't bother to use it. And though Kristin thought full surely that it was not for Erland's good that he had come out and into the king's guard when he was only 16, with this cousin of his for guide and teacher, yet was she moved to smile sorrowfully and tenderly when Munin Bardson talked on and on, while the spittle ran out of the corners of his mouth and the tears oozed from his old red-rimmed eyes. Of Erland's flashing joyous spirit in his boyish years, before unhappy chance had led him astray with Aline Ormsdatter, and scorched him for the rest of his life. Jamelt Halvardsson, sitting in earnest talk with Gaut and Narkvi, looked across at his sister-in-law wonderingly. She had sat down on the crossed wall bench with this unsavoury old man and Ulf Haldarsson. Ulf seemed to Jamelt to look somewhat moodily, but she smiled as she chatted with them, and filled their beakers. He had not seen her smile before, but it became her well, and her little low laughter was like a quite young maid's. Jamelt spoke once of how it was not possible all these 6 brothers could stay at home, living on their mother's manor. No one could look that any rich man of equal birth would give kinswoman of his to Nicolaus if his 5 brothers were to dwell with him, and maybe draw their livelihood from the manor when they wed. And they ought to look about for a wife for the young man now. He was 20 winters old already, and seemed to be of a lusty habit. Therefore Gemelt was minded to take Ivar and Skule with him when he journeyed south again. Doubtless he would find a way to their advancement. When Erlend Nikolausen had met his end in such sorry circumstances, it had plainly appeared that the great nobles of the land thought once more that the slain man had been one of their own peers, marked out by birth and blood to take his place among the foremost, of a winning nature, high-minded in many ways, in war a hardy and valiant chieftain, though fortune had not been with him. The men who had taken part in slaying the master on his own manor were dealt with most sternly, and Gemelt could tell of many who had asked him about Erlend's sons. The men of Suderheim he had met at Yule, and they had let fall that these young lads were their own kin. Sir John had bidden him greet them, and say he would welcome Erlend Nikolausen's sons as a kinsman, and gladly keep any of them that would join his household. John Haftorson was now to be wed with Lady Elin, Erling Vidkunsen's eldest daughter, and the young bride had asked if the youths were like their father. She well remembered that Erlend had visited them in Bjorgvin when she was a child, and that he seemed to her the comeliest of all men. And her brother, Bjarn Erlingson, had said that all he could do for Erlend Nikolausen's sons he would do with all his heart. Kristin sat gazing at her twin sons while Gemelt talked. They grew more and more like their father. Silky fine soot-black hair clung close and smooth to their heads, but curled a little in their forelocks and down over their slim brown necks. They had narrow faces with high-bridged, outstanding noses, and fine small mouths with a knot of muscles at each corner. But they had shorter and broader chins and darker eyes than Erlend. And it was this most of all, his wife now thought, that had made Erlend so wondrous fair, that when his eyes looked up, light blue and clear, out of that lean dark face under the coal-black hair, they took one so unawares. But there was a gleam of steel blue in the young lad's eyes now as Skule answered his uncle. He was wont to be spokesman for the both of them. "We thank you for this good and kindly proffer, kinsman. But we have already spoken with Sir Munin and with Inge, and taken counsel of our eldest brother. And the upshot is that we have come to an accord with Inge and his father. These men are our near kindred on our father's side, and we are to bear Inge company when he rides south, and are going to stay at his manor this summer, and for some further time." The boys came down to their mother in the hall that evening when she had gone to rest. "We think most likely you will understand this, mother," said Ivar. "We will not claim kindred and beg for help and friendship from the men who sat dumb and looked on while our father suffered wrong," added Skule. The mother nodded. She thought her sons did right. Gemelt was a prudent and right-minded man, she saw, and his proffer had been well meant, but she was well pleased that the lads were true to their father. Yet had she never thought of old that the day would come when her sons would serve Brynhild Flüger's son. The twins set forth with Inge Flüger as soon as Ivar was strong enough to ride. The manor grew very still when they were gone. The mother remembered. Last year about this time she lay in the weaving room with the newborn babe. It seemed to her like a dream. So short a time was it since she had felt herself young, with her mind stirred and shaken by a young woman's cares and yearnings, by hope and hate and love. Now was her flock shrunken to 4 sons, and in her mind nothing stirred save disquietude for the grown young men. In this stillness which fell upon Jorengard after the going of the twins, her smouldering fear for Björgulf broke out into flame. On the guests' coming, he and Nakvi had moved down to the old hearthroom house. He rose from his bed in the daytime, but he had not yet been outside the door. With deepest dread, Kristin saw that Björgulf sat ever in the same spot, never crossed the floor, and scarce moved at all when she was in beside him. She knew that his eyes were grown worse in this last sickness. Nakvi was most still and silent, but so he had been ever since his father's death, and he seemed to hold aloof from his mother all that he could. At length one day she took heart and questioned the eldest son how it stood now with Björgulf's sight. For a long time Nakvi turned off her questions, but at last she called on her son to tell his mother the truth. Nakvi said, "In strong light he can still see dimly." As he said it, the young man grew deadly pale, turned sharply away, and went from the room. Late in the day, when the mother had wept herself so weary that she thought now she might trust herself to speak calmly with her son, she went over to the old house. Björgulf lay upon the bed. As soon as she came and sat down by him on the bed's edge, she could see by his face that he knew she had spoken with Nakvi. "Mother, you must not weep, mother," he prayed fearfully. She very much wanted to cast herself down over her son, taken him in her arms, wept over him and wailed his hard lot. But she did but steal her hand into his under the coverlid. "Greatly does God try your manhood, my son," she said hoarsely. The look on Björgulf's face changed, grew firm and steadfast, but it was a little while before he could speak. "I have known for a long time, mother, that I was chosen out to suffer this. Already that time we were at Tautra, Brother Aslak spoke to me of this, and said that should it go thus with me, then, as our Lord Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he said. He said that the true wilderness for a Christian man's soul was when sight and sense were barred. Then he followed the Lord's footsteps out into the wilderness, even though his body were amidst his brethren and his kinsmen. He read of these things from the books of St. Bernard. And if a soul but understand that him hath God chosen in especial for such a hardy trial of manhood, then he need not fear that he cannot abide it. God knows my soul better than the soul knows itself." He went on speaking to his mother after this fashion, comforting her with wisdom and strength of soul which seemed far beyond his years. In the evening Nakvi came to Kristin and begged that he might speak with her alone. Thereupon he said it was his intention and Björgulf's to enter a godly brotherhood and take the vows as monks at Tautra. Kristin stood struck dumb, but Nakvi went on calmly. They would wait till Gaut was of age and could see to their mother's and their younger brother's affairs. They would go into the convent with goods in such measure as befitted the sons of Erland Nikolausen of Huseby, but they would have an eye also to their brother's welfare. From their father, the Erlandsons had nothing in heritage worth the speaking of, but the three who were born before Gunnulf Nikolausen went into the cloister owned some parcel of farms north of the fells. He had given gifts to his nephews when he had made division of his wealth, though most of what he gave not to the church and godly works he made over to his brother. And, said Nakvi, if he and Björgulf didn't claim their full share of the heritage, it would be a help to Gaut too, who was now to be head of the house and carry it onward, that they too should die to the world. Kristin felt as though a blow had stunned her. Never had she dreamed that Nakvi would think of a monk's life. But she spoke nothing against it. She was so overcome. and she dared not try to turn her son's mind from so fair and so profitable a purpose. Even while we were boys dwelling together in the cloister there in the north, we two promised each other we would never part our company, said Narkvi. His mother nodded. She knew it, but she had thought, the way it was meant, that Björgulf should go on living with Narkvi, even when the eldest brother wed. It seemed to Kristin well nigh a miracle that Björgulf, so young as he was, could bear his ill fortune so manfully. The times she spoke with him of it throughout the spring, she heard nothing from his lips but brave and God-fearing words. 'Twas scarce to be understood, it seemed to her, but it must surely be that he had known for many years already what would come of his dim-sightedness. And so, perhaps, he had been arming his soul with patience ever since the time he dwelt amongst the monks. But since this was so, she could not but think how hard and heavy had been the lot of this luckless child of hers, and how little she had understood, standing by with mind filled full of her own concerns. And now Kristin would steal, each moment she was alone, to kneel down before the likeness of Mary Virgin at home in the loft, and before her altar northward in the church as often as it was opened, grieving from the bottom of her heart, and with humble tears she prayed the Redeemer's gentle mother to be to Björgulf in a mother's stead, and to make good to him all that his mother in the flesh had left undone. One summer night Kristin lay awake. Narkvi and Björgulf had gone back to the upper hall, but Gaut lay below with Lavrans, for the elder brothers had a mind to practice them in watching and praying, Narkvi had said. She was about to drop asleep at last, when she was aroused by a noise of one moving stealthily up in the loft balcony. There were footfalls on the stairs. She knew the blind man's tread. It was but that he had some errand, she thought, yet she got up and felt for her clothes. Then she heard the door above thrown open. Someone cleared the steps in 2 or 3 bounds. The mother ran to the outer room and threw open the door. The mist lay so thick outside that the storehouses across the courtyard were but dimly seen. Up by the manor gate, Björgulf was fighting furiously to free himself from his brother's hold. "Will you lose anything?" cried the blind man, "if you be quit of me? Then you were free of all your vows, and you had no need to die to this earthly home." What Narkvi answered, Kristin could not hear. She ran out barefoot into the dripping wet grass. Björgulf had wrenched himself free now. Then he dropped, as though felled by a blow, down over the great stone, and beat upon it with his clenched fists. Narkvi saw his mother and came hastily some few steps forwards. "Go inside, mother. I can deal best with this alone." "You shall go in, I say," he whispered urgently. Then turned and stood again, bowed over his brother. The mother stood watching a little way off. The sward was soaking wet. Water dripped from all the roofs, and drops trickled from every leaf. It had rained all the day, but now the clouds were sunk low in the thick white fog. When, after a while, her sons came down the path, Narkvi had hold of Björgulf beneath the arm and led him. Kristin shrank back within the outer room door. She saw that Björgulf's face was bleeding. Probably he had struck it against the stone. Unwittingly, Kristin thrust her hand within her mouth and bit into her own flesh. On the stairs, Björgulf tried once again to tear himself from Narkvi. He stumbled against the wall, crying, I curse the day that I was born." When she had heard Narkvi bar the door of the loft behind them, their mother stole up after them and stood in the balcony outside. For a long time she could hear Björgulf's voice from within. He raged, shrieked and cursed. One or two of his wild words she could make out. Between whiles she heard that Narkvi spoke to him, but his voice came to her as a muffled murmur only. At length Bjorgulf fell into a loud and heart-rending sobbing. The mother stood, shivering with cold and grief. She had on her but a cloak flung over her shift. She stood there so long that her loose flowing hair was wetted by the raw night air. At last silence fell within the loft. When she was come into the room below, she went to the bed where Gaut and Lavrans slept. They had heard nothing. While her tears ran down, she put out her hand in the dark, felt the two warm faces, and listened to the boy's healthy breathing. It seemed to her that now these two were all she had left of her riches. Shuddering with cold, she crept up into her own bed. One of the dogs that lay over by Gaut's bed pattered across the floor, jumped up beside her, and curled up on her feet. He was wont to do this of nights, and she scarce had the heart to drive him away, though he was heavy and weighed upon her legs so that they grew numb. But Erland had owned the dog, and it was his favourite, a coal-black, ragged old bear-hound. Tonight Kristin thought it was good that it should lie there and thaw her frozen feet. She saw nothing of Narkvi the next morning till the morning meal. Then he came in and sat down in the high seat. This had been his place ever since his father died. He said not a word throughout the meal, and there were black rings about his eyes. His mother followed when he went out again. "How is it with Bjorgulf now?" she asked in a low voice. Narkvi shunned her look, but he answered as low that Bjorgulf slept now. "Has he been like this before?" she whispered fearfully. Narkvi nodded, turned away, and went up to his brother again. Narkvi watched over Bjorgulf late and early, and kept his mother away from him all he could. But Kristin knew that the two young men had many a heavy hour together. It was Nicolaus Erlandsson who should have been master at Jorengard now, but he could find no time to pay the least heed to the farming. It seemed too that, like his father, he had small mind to the work and little skill in it. So Kristin and Gaut had the whole charge upon their shoulders, because for this summer Ulf Haldarsson too forsook her. After the hapless doings that ended with Erland Nicolausson's slaying, Ulf's wife had gone home with her brother. Ulf stayed on at Jorengard. He said he would show folk he would not be driven out by lies and gossip. But he hinted nonetheless that here his time was well nigh spent. He thought maybe he would betake himself north of the fells to his own farm in Scown, when so much time had gone by that no one might say he had fled from the slanders. But then the bishop's deputy began to bring in question whether Ulf Haldarsson had put away his wife unlawfully. On this Ulf made ready to depart, fetched Jartrud, and was now to set forth for the north ere the autumn storms made the roads across the mountains toilsome. To Gaut he said he would join company with his half-sister's husband, that was an armourer in Nidaros. His brother's son would still work his Vjoldverkstadt farm for him, and he would send Jartrud to dwell there. On the last night Kristin drank to Ulf from the silver-gilt beaker her father had had in heritage from his father's father, Sir Ketil the Swede. She prayed that he would take the beaker and keep it in memory of her. Thereafter she set a gold ring that had been Erland's upon his finger, and bade him wear it for his kinsman's sake. Ulf kissed her in thanks. "'Tis one of the dues of kin," he said, laughing. "You didn't think, Kristin, for sure, when first we met, and I was serving man that came to fetch you and bring you to my master, that we should part in this way." Kristin flushed crimson, for he was smiling at her with his old mocking smile, Yet she deemed she saw in his eyes that he was sad. So she said, "None the less, Ulf, I think you long for the Trondheim country, you who were born and bred there in the north. I've longed for the fjord there many a time, I who lived there but those few years." Ulf laughed as before, and then she said low, "If in my youth I caused you offence at any time by haughtiness, or I knew not then that you were near kinsmen, you and Erland, you must forgive it me now." "Nay, and it was not Erland who would not own the kinship, but I was so high and mighty when I was young. Since my father had cast me out from among my kindred, I would not beg for a place." He rose hastily and went over to where Björgulf sat on the bench. "Please understand, Björgulf, my fosterling. Your father and Gunnulf, they showed me the hearts of kinsmen from the time when we first met as boys, far otherwise than my brothers and sisters at Hestnes. Afterwards, I never put myself forward as Erland's kinsman unless I saw that thereby I could better serve him and his wife and you, my foster sons. Do you understand this?" he said vehemently, and laid his hand over Björgulf's face, hiding the sightless eyes. "I understand." Björgulf's answer came half smothered through the other's fingers. He nodded behind Ulf's hand. "We understand, foster father." Nicolaus laid his hand heavily on Ulf's shoulder, and Gaut drew closer to the group. A strange feeling came to Kristin. It was as though they were speaking of things she had no knowledge of. Then she too went forward to the men, saying, "Trust me, Ulf, kinsman, we all understand. None of us, not this family nor Erland, had any other friend so trusty as you. God bless you." The next day Ulf Haldarsson set forth for the north. As the winter went on, Björgulf grew more at peace, so far as Kristin could see. He came again to the household meals and went to Mass with the folk, and he took in willing and friendly wise at Kristin's hand the help and service she was so glad to render to him. And as the time went by, and Kristin never heard her sons say anything more of the cloister, she felt herself how unspeakably loath she was to give up her eldest son to the convent life. She could not but see that for Björgulf the cloister would sure be for the best. But she didn't know how she could endure to lose Narkvi in this way. It must be, after all, that the firstborn was in a way knit to the mother's heart yet more closely than were the other sons. Nor could she see that Narkvi was fitted to be a monk. True enough, he had a passing good head for the arts of learning and a love for godly exercises. Yet, all the same, he didn't seem to his mother to be truly devout of mind. He showed no zeal in attendance at his parish church, missing the services often on slender grounds, and she knew that neither he nor Björgulf made to their parish priest anything but the common confession of sins. The new priest, Sira Dag Rolfsson, was a son of Rolf of Blackasarv, who had been wed with Ranfrid Ivarsdatter's cousin, and he came much to his kinswoman's manner. He was a young man of about 30 years, learned and a good clerk, but the two eldest sons met him with coldness. Howbeit with Gaut he was good friends straight away. Gaut was the only one of the Erlandssons who had made friends amongst the folk of Sill. But yet none of the others had kept himself so much a stranger in the parish as had Nicolaus. He never mixed with the other youths. If so be he went where the youth were met for dancing or trysting, he would stand most often aside at the border of the green and look on, with the attitude of one who thought himself too good to take part. But should the whim take him, he would join in the game unbidden. From vain glory, folk said, to show off his powers. He was lusty, strong and nimble, easily egged on to fight. And after he had set down 2 or 3 of the most renowned fighters of the parish, folk thought it best to put up with his manners. And if he had a mind to dance with a maid, he paid no heed either to brothers or kinsmen, but danced with the girl and after sat alone with her. And never did it happen that a woman said no when Nicolaus Erlandsen proffered her his company. He was none the better liked for this. Since his brother was grown quite blind, Narkvi seldom left him, but if it chanced that he went out of an evening, he bore himself in no other way than he had always done. He had given up too, for the most part, his long hunting trips, but nonetheless this same autumn he had bought of the warden a most costly white falcon, and he was as zealous as ever to practise his archery and sports. Björgulf had taught himself to play chess in spite of his blindness, and the brothers often spent whole days over the chessboard. They were both most eager players. At this time Kristin heard that folk were talking of Narkvi and a young maid, Sigrid Undset of Skien. The next year the girl lay up at the sæter the summer through, and Narkvi more than once was away from home by night. Kristin came to know that he had been with Tordis. The mother's heart trembled and turned hither and thither like an aspen leaf on its stalk. Tordis was of an old and honourable kin. She herself was a good innocent child. It was impossible that Narkvi could have the heart to wrong her. If the 2 young folk forgot themselves, then he must make this girl his wife. Sick with dread and shame of her own thoughts, Kristin yet knew in her heart that it would surely not grieve her overmuch if so it turned out. But 2 years before she wouldn't have considered it, that Tordis Gunnarsdatter should be mistress of Jorengard after her. The maid's father's father was still living, and dwelt on the manor with 4 married sons. She herself had many brothers and sisters. She would be a poorly dowered bride, and each woman of that kindred had ever had 1 witless child at the least. The mountain people either changed the children or cast a spell on them. In spite of everything they could do to guard the lying-in women and make them safe, neither baptism nor exorcism seemed to do any good. There were 2 old men now at Skien whom Sire Eirik had adjudged to be changelings, 2 deaf and dumb children, and Tordis's eldest brother had been bewitched by the wood elf when he was in his 17th year. Otherwise the Skien kindred were a goodly tribe. They had luck with their cattle, and they throve in all their doings. But there were so many of them, it was impossible they could lay up riches. God alone might know whether Narkvi could draw back from his purpose without sin, if he had vowed him already to Mary Virgin's service. But she knew that a man must ever prove him for a year as a novice in the cloister before he took the vows. He could draw back even then, if he felt he was not called to serve God in this way. And she had heard how a count's lady of Valant, who was mother to the great doctor in religion and preaching friar Sir Thomas Aquinas, had shut her son in with a fair and wanton woman to shake his purpose when he was minded to forsake the world. Kristin thought this was the foulest deed she had ever heard, and yet this woman died at peace with God. So perhaps it could not be so fearful a sin in her, if she thought now that she would welcome Tordis of Skien with open arms as her son's wife. In the autumn, Jamelt Halvardsen came to Formoe, and from him they learned the truth of the rumours of great tidings that had spread up through the dale before his coming. With consent of the foremost fathers of the church and the knights and esquires of the council of Norway's realm, Sir Magnus Eirikson had resolved to part his kingdom between the 2 sons he had got by his queen, the Lady Blanche. At the diet at Varberg he had bestowed on the younger, Prince Hakon, the name of king in Norway. The chiefs of the realm, both clerks and laymen, had sworn upon the Lord's body to hold and guard the land for him. It was said he was a fair and likely child of 3 years old, and was to be nurtured here in Norway, with 4 of the best Norse dames for foster mothers, and 2 church and 2 lay lords for foster fathers, when King Magnus and Queen Blanche were in Sweden. Sir Erling Vidkundsen and the bishops of Bjorgvin and Oslo, it was said, had thought out this choice of king, and Bjarne Erlingsson had furthered the matter most with King Magnus. For of all men in Norway's land he loved Bjarne the best. And all men thought it would be a great gain to Norway's might and welfare, that now we should have a king again who made his home amongst us, and would guard our laws and rights, and the land's weal, instead of wasting his time and strength and the realm's wealth on enterprises in other lands. Kristin had heard of the choice of king, even as she had heard of the feuds with the German merchants in Bjorgvin, and of the king's wars in Sweden and Denmark. But the tidings had touched her little. It was like the echoes of thunderclaps amidst the mountains, when the storm passes over far-off countrysides. Her sons, she knew, had talked among themselves of these things. But by Jamelt's tale, Erlend's sons were vehemently stirred. Bjorgulf sat with his forehead on his hand, hiding his blind eyes. Gaut listened with lips a little open, his hand clutching his dagger's hilt. Lavrans breathed quick and heavily, and kept ever looking from his aunt's husband over at Narkvi in the high seat. The eldest son was pale of face, and his eyes glowed. "It has been the lot of many a man," said Narkvi, "that they who stood against him most stiffly in life went forward to victory on the road he showed them, when they had first laid him out as food for worms. When once his mouth was filled with mould, lesser men than he are happy enough to agree that he spoke true." "Aye, maybe so, kinsman," said Jamelt soothingly. "There is truth in what you say. Your father, first of all men, thought of this way out of the slough, to put 2 brothers on the thrones here and in Sweden. A deep-thinking, wise and great-hearted knight was Erland Nicolausson, I think. But be wary of your speech, Nicolaus. It would not do well for you to have such words go abroad from you as might work harm to Skule. Skule did not ask my leave for what he has done," said Narkvi sharply. "No, he didn't remember, perhaps, that you are come of age now," answered Jamelt as before. "And I didn't think about it either. So it was with my consent and goodwill that he laid his hand on Bjarne's sword and swore." "Oh, he remembered it all right," said Narkvi. "But the cub knew full well that I would never have given my consent. And the Gisk men stood indeed, no doubt, of this salve for a pricking conscience." Skule Erlendsson had taken service with Bjarne Erlingsson as his sworn follower. He had met the young noble at Yuletide when visiting his mother's sister at Elin, and Bjarne had made it clear to the boy that it was most through Sir Erling's pleadings and his own that Erland's life had been pardoned. Without their backing, it was impossible Simon Andersson's errand to King Magnus would have borne fruit. Ivar was still with Inge Fluga. Kristin knew that what Bjarne Erlingsson had said was not wholly untrue. It fitted in well enough with Simon's own tale of his journey to Tunsberg. Nevertheless, she had all these years thought with great bitterness of Erling Vidkundsen. It seemed to her that he must needs have had the power to help her husband to win better terms had he had the will. Bjarne perhaps counted for little at that time, being but a boy. Howsoever it was, she did not like overmuch that Skule had bound himself to this man, and it took her breath strangely that the twins took their own way and had ventured out into the wide world in this way. They seemed to her still but children. After this visit of Jamelt's, the unrest in her spirit waxed so great that she could scarce bear to think. If it were, as the men thought, that it would further so much the well-being and safety of the people of the land that this tiny boy in Tunsberg Castle should now be called King of Norway, then this great gain for the folk might have been won nearly 10 years before, had Erland not... No, she would not think of that when she thought of the dead. But she could not help herself, were it but because she knew that in the sons' eyes their father stood out glorious and perfect, the foremost of warriors and chieftains, without spot or blemish. And she herself, indeed, had thought all these years that Erland had been betrayed by his fellows and his rich kinsmen. Her husband had suffered great wrong, but Narkvi overshot the mark when he said they had laid him out to be food for worms. She, too, it was sure, bore her own heavy share of the blame. But most of all it was Erland's own folly and his ungoverned self-will that had brought him to his hapless end. None the less it was bitter to her that Skule should now be Bjarn Erlingson's man. Would she never see the day when she would be set free from the endless torture of unrest and dread? Oh, Jesus, remembering the care and sorrow thy blessed mother suffered for thy sake, have mercy upon me, a mother, and comfort me. Even for Gaut she had fears. There was the stuff in the boy for a husbandman of the best, but he was so headlong in his eagerness to set the fortunes of the house on their feet again. Narkvi gave him a free hand, and Gaut had so many irons in the fire. Along with some other men in the parish, he had now taken up the old iron blast furnaces in the fells. And he sold away too much. Sold not only of what came in as rent in kind, but of the stuff from the home farm too. All of her life, Kristin had been used to see the storehouses and warerooms on her manor full to overflowing, and she was more than a little angry when Gaut turned up his nose at rank butter and made a mock of the 10-year-old bacon she had hanging. She wanted to feel that on her manor there should never be a lack of food, that no poor folk need be turned away empty from her door if the black dearth should come again to the countryside. And there should be nothing lacking when days of bride ales and child ales and feasting came again to the old manor. Her high-flown hopes for her sons shrank and dwindled. She would be content if they came to rest here in the parish. She could exchange and bring together her estates so that 3 of them might be settled on their own farms. And Jorengard, with the part of Lagabru that lay this side of the river, would suffice to keep 3 freeholders. If their lot were not that of great esquires, yet at the least they would not be poor folk. And here in the dale was peace. All this unrest among the chieftains of the land was little heard of and little heeded here. Even if this might be thought an abatement of the power and worship of the kindred, yet it was in God's power to lead those who came after on to greater things, if he saw it would be for their good. But perhaps it was vain for her to hope that she should see them gathered about her in this way. They would scarce come to rest so easily, these sons of hers who had Erland Nicolausson for father. It was at this time that her soul was wont to find peace and solace, if she let her thoughts run on the 2 little children she had laid to rest up in the graveyard. Each day in these years she had thought of them, wondered when she saw children as old as they, growing and thriving, what hers would have been like now. When now she went about her daily tasks, deft and diligent as ever, but withdrawn and full of thought, the dead children were always with her. In her dreams they grew and throve, and their natures were in every way just as she would have had them. Munin was as faithful to his kinsman as Narkvi, while in his ways with his mother he was as merry and frank as Gaut. But unlike him, never scared her with doubtful plans. He was gentle and thoughtful as Lavrans, But all the strange thoughts that Munin pondered, he talked of freely with his mother. In mother wit he was Björgulf's like, but no mischance darkened his road through life, and thus his wisdom was untouched by bitterness. He was self-assured, strong and bold as the twins, but not so unruly and self-willed. And all the sweet, joyous memories of her children's lovesomeness when they were little, these she called up again when she thought of little Erland. He stood upon her lap to be dressed. She held her hands about his fat, naked form, and with tiny hands and upturned face, and all his precious body, he strained upward toward her face and her caresses. She taught him to walk. She had laid a folded cloth across his breast and up below his armpits. In this harness he hung heavy as a sack, working away so blunderingly and drolly with his feet, laughing himself till he twisted about like a little worm. She bore him with her on her arm out into the farmyard to the calves and lambs. He screamed with joy at the sow with all her piglets, threw back his head and gaped at the doves up on the stable loft. He ran beside her in the tall grass by the stone heaps, cried out for each berry he saw, and ate them from out of her hand so eagerly that her palm was all wet from his little greedy mouth. All the joys she had had of her children she called to mind, and lived over again in this dream life with these two little ones, and all the sorrows she forgot. Spring was come for the third time since Erland was laid in his grave. Kristin heard no more of Tordis and Nakvi, but neither did she hear anything of the cloister, and her hopes grew. She could not help herself. She was so reluctant to give up her eldest son to the monkish life. Just before John's Mass, Ivar Erlandsson came home to Jorengard. The twins had been 16-year-old, growing lads when they set forth from home. Ivar was a grown man now, near 18 years old, and his mother thought he had grown so fair and manly she could only stare at him. His mother bore his breakfast up to Ivar the first morning while he was laying in bed. Wheat and honey bread, bannocks and ale that she had drawn from the last barrel of the Yuletide brew. She sat upon the bed's edge while he ate and drank, smiled at everything he said, stood up and looked at his clothes, turned and felt each garment, rummaged in his travelling bag, weighed his new silver buckle in her narrow red-browned hand, drew his dagger from its sheath, praised it and all his gear. Then she sat down again upon the bed, looked on her son, and listened with a smile in her eyes and about her lips to all the young man's tales. "It were best, my mother, I should tell you what errand has brought me hither. I have come to get Nakvi's assent to my marriage." Astounded, Kristin smote her hands together. "Ivar mine! You are so young! Sure, have you not been playing any foolish pranks?" Ivar asked his mother to listen. She was a youngish widow, Sigrid Undset of Ronheim in Fauskar. The manor was worth 60 silver marks, and the most of it her own. She had it in heritage from her only child. But she had been drawn into a lawsuit with her husband's kin, and Inchfluga had sought all manner of unlawful gain for himself, if he was to help the widow to her rights. Ivar had grown angry and had taken the woman's part and gone with her to the bishop himself, for Sir Halvard had shown Ivar fatherly goodwill at all times when he had met with him. Inge Munenson's doing in his wardenship would not bear close scrutiny, but he had known how to keep friendship with the great people in the parishes and to frighten the common folk into a mousehole, and in throwing dust in the bishop's eyes he had shown great skill. 'Twas like, too, that, for Munen's sake, Sir Halvard was not minded to be over-strict. But now things looked none too well for Inge, and so the second cousins had not parted as friends when Ivar took his horse and rode from Inchfluga's manor. But then it had come to his mind that he might go south and greet the folks at Ronheim ere he left that countryside. That was at Eastertide, and he had been with Signy since, helped her on her manor in the spring, and now they had agreed together that he should wed her. She didn't think that Ivar Erlendsson was too young to be her husband and take her welfare in charge. And he was in favour with the bishop, as he had said. Sure enough, he was too young and untaught as yet for Sir Halvar to entrust him with any office, but Ivar had good hopes that he would make his way if he wed at Ronheim. Kristin sat playing with the bunch of keys in her lap. This, sure enough, was sage and sober talk. And well she thought that Inchfluga deserved nothing better. But she wondered much what the poor old man Munin Bardson would say to this. Of the bride she learned that Signy was 30 winters old, and of poor and humble stock, but her first husband had prospered, so that now she was in good estate, and she was herself an honourable, kindly, and notable woman. Nicolaus and Gaut went south with Ivar to see the widow, but Kristin stayed behind to be with Bjorgulf. When her sons came home, Narkvi brought the tidings to his mother that Ivar was now betrothed to Signy Gammalsdatter. The wedding was to be held at Ronheim in the autumn. Not long after his homecoming, Narkvi came in to his mother one evening when she sat sewing in the weaving house. He barred the door within. He said then to his mother that now Gaut was 20, and Ivar too, by reason of his marriage, was become his own master. It was his and Bjorgulf's intent to journey north this next autumn, and pray to be received as novices into the cloister. Kristin did not say much in answer, and what more was said was but of the ordering of the portion that the 2 eldest sons must now be given from the estate. But a few days later men came to Jorengard to bid them to a feast. Asmund of Skane was to hold his granddaughter Tordis's betrothal ale with the worthy yeoman's son of Dovre. Narkvi came in to his mother in the weaving house that night too, and again he barred the door behind him. He sat down on the edge of the hearth-place and sat raking with a stick in the embers. Kristin had made a little fire, for the nights were cold that summer. Nothing but feasting and revelling, mother mine," he said, laughing a little. "Betrothal feast at Ronheim and betrothal feast at Skane, and then it will be Ivar's wedding. But when Tordis rides to church to her bridal, I shall not be of the company, I think. I shall have donned the cloister garb by then." Kristin did not answer immediately. But then she said, without looking up from her seam, it was a wedding coat for Ivar, "Many people thought that it would be a grief to Tordis Gunnarsdatter if you turned monk." "I had once thought so myself," said Narkvi. Kristin let the sewing sink upon her lap. She looked at her son. His face was set and calm, and he was so fair. His dark hair, combed back from his white forehead, clustered so softly behind his ears and over the slender brown pillar of his neck. His features were shapelier than his father's. His face was broader and firmer, the nose not so big and the mouth not so small. His clear blue eyes lay fairly set beneath the straight black eyebrows, and yet he did not seem so comely as Erland had been. It was his father's animal-like suppleness and grace, the breath of never-fading youth about him, that Narkvi lacked. The mother took up her work again, but she did not sew. After a little she said, while she looked down and smoothed an edge of the cloth with her needle, "Bear in mind, Narkvi, I have yet said no single word against your godly purpose. I would not be so bold. But you are young, and you, who are much more learned than I, know well Somewhere in the scriptures it is written, "It ill beseems a man to turn and look back over his shoulder when once he has set his hand to the plough." Not a muscle of her son's face moved. "I know that for a long time you too have had this in your thoughts," his mother went on. "Ever since you were children. You didn't understand then yourselves what you would forego. Now you are come to a man's estate. Don't you think it were fit that you should prove yourself a little longer, whether or not you have the call? You are born to be the master of this manor, and the head of your house." "You make bold to counsel me now?" Narkvi drew breath heavily once or twice. He rose. Of a sudden he took hold on his bosom, tore apart his coat and shirt, so that the mother looked upon his naked breast, where the birthmark, the 5 small blood-red fiery flecks, shone amidst the black curling down. "You thought maybe I was too young to understand what you were saying when you sighed out with tears and moans as you kissed me here when I was a little child. I didn't understand it then, but the words you spoke I never could forget. Mother, have you forgotten that father died the most miserable of deaths, unshriven and unhouseled, and you dare to gainsay our purpose? We brothers know well what we turn from. We think it's none so great a loss if I lose this manor, and cut myself off from wedlock, and such peace and joy as you and my father had together all the years I can remember." Kristin let fall her sewing. All her life with Erland, the evil and the good, the rich wealth of memories came over her in a flood. So little, then, did this child know what he was foregoing. With all his boyish battles, his venturesome deeds, his playing at love and gallantry, he was nothing else but an innocent child. Narkvi saw the tears come into his mother's eyes. He cried aloud, quoting a Bible verse, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" Kristin started in dread, but her son spoke on in a vehement tumult of mind. God didn't say these words, I think, to condemn his mother. But he corrected her, the pure pearl without spot or blemish, when she would have counselled him how he should use the power he had got from his Father in heaven, and not from his mother in the flesh. "Mother, you must not counsel me in this matter. Do not dare to do it." Kristin bent her head upon her breast. A little after, Narkvi said, very low, "Have you forgotten, Mother, that you drove me away from you?" He stopped, as though he could not trust his own voice. But then he went on again. "I wanted to kneel with you at my father's deathbed, but you sent me away. Don't you think my heart has been wrung in my bosom as often as I thought of it?" Kristin whispered, so low it was scarce to be heard. "Is that why you have been so cold towards me all these years, since I have been widowed?" The son was silent. "I begin to understand. You have never forgiven me for this, Narkvi." Narkvi looked down, aside. "Sometimes I have forgiven you, Mother," he said in a faint voice. "It was not often, I think." "Narkvi," she cried in bitter moan, "do you think my love for Björgulf was less than yours? I am his mother. I am mother to you both. You were cruel when you barred the door between him and me." Nakvi's pale face grew yet whiter. "Yes, mother, I did bar the door against you." "Cruel, you say? Jesus comfort you. You don't know." His voice died away in a whisper, as though the boy's strength were ebbed away. I thought you should not. We must spare you, at least." He turned sharp about, went to the door and unbarred it. But then he stood there unmoving, with his back to Kristin. At length she called him softly by his name. On that he came back and stood before her with bowed head. "Mother, I know well this is not easy for you." She laid her hands upon his shoulders. He hid his face from her sight, but he bowed down his head and kissed one of her wrists. Kristin remembered that his father had done this once, when she could not recall. She stroked his sleeve, and on that he lifted his hand and patted her on the cheek. Afterwards they sat down, and sat in silence a little. "Mother," said Nakvi in a while, in a steady, even voice, "do you still have the cross that was my brother Orm's?" "Yes," said Kristin. "He told them to ask me never to part from it." "I think that had Orm known of this, he would have given consent that it should come down to me. Now shall I, too, have neither kin nor heritage?" Kristin drew forth from under her shift the little silver cross. Nakvi took it from her hand. It was still warm from his mother's breast. Reverently he kissed the reliquary in the midst of the cross, clipped the thin chain about his neck, and thrust the trinket in under his clothing. "Do you remember your brother Orm?" asked his mother. "I don't know. At times, maybe. But perhaps it is but that you spoke so much of him when I was little." Nakvi sat on there a little while beside his mother. Then he stood up. "Good night, mother." "God bless you, Nakvi. Good night." He went. Kristin folded up Ivar's bridal coat, laid it with her sewing gear, and quenched the fire. "God bless you. God bless you, Nakvi mine." Then she blew out the candle and left the old house. It chanced a little while after that Kristin met Tortoise at a manor in the outskirts of the parish. There was sickness amongst the manor folk, and they had not got in their hay, so the brothers and sisters of Olaf's guild went thither to lend them a hand with the work. In the evening Kristin bore the girl company part of her way home. She walked slowly, as one well on in years, chatting with the girl, and before long she had led the talk in such a way that Tortoise of her own accord had told Nakvi's mother all that had been between him and her. Yes, she had been wont to meet him in their home paddock, and last summer when she lay at the saeter, he had been with her more times than one at night. But he had never offered to be overbold with her. She knew well what folk said of Nakvi in general. To her he had never done wrong, either in word or in deed, but he had lain by her side upon the bed-covers once or twice, and they had talked together. Once she had asked him if it were his purpose to ask for her in marriage, and he had answered that he could not. He had vowed him to the service of Mary Virgin. He said the same this last spring one time they spoke together, and so she would no longer set herself against her grandfather's and her father's wills. "It must needs have brought down evil upon you both, had he broken his vow, and you defied your kinsfolk," said Kristin. She stood leaning upon her rake, looking on the young maid. A gentle, round, and comely face this child had, and the fairest bright hair in a heavy plait. "God will surely grant you happiness, my Tortoise. He seems a gallant good lad, your betrothed." "Aye, I like Harvard well," said the girl, and then burst into bitter weeping. Kristin comforted her with such words as were fitting in the mouth of an old and a staid woman. Her own heart ached with yearning. She had so gladly called this good, fresh child her daughter. After Ivar's wedding, she stayed a while at Ronheim. Sigrid Undset was not fair, and she looked worn and old, but she was gentle and winning. She seemed to cherish a heartfelt love for her young husband, and she welcomed his mother and brothers as though she thought they stood so far above her it was not possible she should honour and serve them enough. For Kristin it was quite a new thing that any should put themselves out to guess her wishes and care for her heedfully. Not even while she was the rich lady of Huseby, with a host of serving folk to do her bidding, had any served her as though they took thought for the mistress's ease and well-being. She had never spared herself when all work for the good of the whole household was on her shoulders, and none else had even bethought them that she should be spared. So Signy's ready thoughtfulness for her mother-in-law's well-being all the time she was at Ronheim did Kristin's heart good. She soon grew to love Signy so well that, nearly as much as she prayed to God to bless Ivar's wedded life, she also prayed that Signy might never have cause to repent that she had given herself and all she had to so young a husband. And so, just after Michael's Mass, Nakvi and Björgulf journeyed northward to the Trondheim country. All that she had heard of them since was that they had come to Nidaros in good case, and that they had been received as novices into the brotherhood at Tautra. Soon now would Kristin have dwelt a year on Jorengard with but 2 of her sons to bear her company. But she herself wondered that it was only a year. For that day in autumn of last year, when she had been as far as Dovre with the 2 and came riding by the church and looked down upon the lower slopes, lying sheeted in cold mist, so that she could not make out the houses on her own manor, she had thought that so must they feel who ride towards their home, knowing that the houses lie there burnt to ashes and cold charred wood. Now, when she turned homewards by the old path past the smithy garth, this year it was but all overgrown, and tufts of yellow bedstraw, bluebells and vetch swept over it from the edges of the rank hayfield. Almost it seemed to her that what she saw was a picture of her own life. The weather-beaten, sooty old hearth-place that never again would have fire kindled upon it. The ground about it was strewn thick with powdered charcoal, but soft, short, glossy grass was springing up all over the plot where the fire had raged. And from the cracks of the old fireplace bloomed the long pink tassels of the willow herb, which sows itself in all places.